They say you can judge a person's character, not by how they treat their equals, but by how they treat someone who's made a mistake, someone vulnerable, someone who can't fix what they've broken. Los Angeles, 1965. Nancy Sinatra Sr. Bear. A Saturday evening party, 40 guests, laughter, music, the clinking of champagne glasses, and in the center of it all, Frank Sinatra playing host at his ex-wife's home. Because even after divorce, some bonds remain unbreakable. Jane Hoag stood near a table, holding a drink, trying not to look as nervous as she felt. She was 24 years old, a junior reporter at Life magazine's Los Angeles bureau. She'd been invited, because she'd gone to school with Nancy Sinatra Jr., Frank's daughter. But being in a room with Frank Sinatra, the Frank Sinatra, was terrifying. She leaned back against the table just for a moment, just to steady herself, and then she felt it. Her elbow connecting with something, a sound, porcelain on wood, then porcelain on marble floor, the crash, the shattering, and then the silence. 40 people stopped talking. 40 people turned to look, and Jane Hoag looked down at the pieces of alabaster scattered across the floor, and realized she'd just broken one of Nancy Sinatra Sr.'s most precious possessions. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become one of the most talked about moments in Hollywood history. Not because of scandal, not because of drama, but because of what Frank Sinatra did next. An act of grace so profound, so spontaneous, that everyone who witnessed it would tell the story for the rest of their lives. This is that story. The story of a young reporter's worst nightmare. And the moment Frank Sinatra showed 40 people what true class really looks like. Los Angeles, Saturday evening, spring 1965. Nancy Sinatra, Sr., quote, "Some was alive with conversation and laughter. The house, elegant but warm, reflected NY's personality, sophisticated but welcoming. She decorated it herself after the divorce, making it a refuge for her children, and a gathering place for friends. Tonight was one of those gatherings. Nothing formal, just friends, family, and a few carefully chosen guests. Nancy Jr. had invited her friend Jane Hoag from school, knowing Jane would appreciate the invitation. Jane had just started at Life magazine and was trying to find her footing in journalism. Frank Sinatra was there too, he often was. The divorce had been finalized in 1951, 14 years ago, but Frank and Nancy Sr. maintained a relationship that confused outsiders but made perfect sense to them. They were family, the parents of 3 children, and when Nancy hosted parties, Frank often played host alongside her. Jane had arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening, nervous but excited. She'd met Frank briefly when Nancy Jr. introduced them. "Dad, you remember Jane from school?" Frank shook her hand. "Sure, how are you, kid? Nancy tells me you're at Life now?" "Yes, sir, just started." "Don't call me sir, makes me feel ancient, it's Frank." Jane relaxed slightly. Frank was charming, warm, making everyone feel at ease. The party flowed naturally. Conversations about politics, music, upcoming films. Frank told stories that made people laugh. Nancy Sr. moved through the room, making sure everyone had drinks and food. By 9 o'clock in the evening, Jane had found a comfortable spot near a table in the living room. She was talking to another guest about the civil rights movement when she shifted her weight, leaning back against the table for support. Her elbow hid something. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of porcelain sliding across polished wood. She turned, instinctively, reaching out, but it was too late. The alabaster bird, about 6 inches tall, delicate, beautiful, slid off the edge of the table and fell. The sound when it hit the marble floor was sickening. A sharp crack, then the scatter of pieces. Jane froze. The room went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound. Jane looked down at the shattered pieces. Her face went white. Her hands started shaking. She looked up and saw Nancy Sr. across the room, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition of what had broken. And then Nancy Jr. cut through the silence. "Oh, that was one of my mother's favorite." But she didn't finish the sentence, because Frank Sinatra had turned to look at her, and the look on his face, not angry but firm, stopped her mid-word. The room held its breath. 40 people watched Frank as he set down his drink and walked slowly across the room toward the table where Jane stood frozen, mortified, wishing the floor would open and swallow her. Frank reached the table. He looked down at the shattered alabaster bird. Then he looked at Jane. Her eyes were filling with tears. She was trying to speak, trying to apologize, but no words would come. And then Frank did something nobody expected. He looked at the table at the other alabaster bird, the matching piece, still sitting there, perfectly intact. Without a word, without hesitation, Frank reached out with his index finger and flicked it hard. The second bird flew off the table, arced through the air, and smashed on the marble floor, right next to the pieces of the first one. The sound echoed through the silent room. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, Frank put his arm gently around Jane's shoulders. His voice was soft, warm, completely at ease. "That's okay, kid." Jane looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Sinatra, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "Hey," Frank interrupted gently. "Accidents happen. It's just a thing. Things break. Don't worry about it. But your wife, ex-wife," Frank corrected with a smile, "and trust me, she's not going to care about a couple of birds when she's got 40 happy people in her home. Right, Nancy?" He looked across the room at Nancy Sr., who was standing there with her hand over her mouth, tears in her own eyes. But she was smiling. "Right, Frank?" she said softly. "It's just a thing." Frank squeezed Jane's shoulder. "See? All good. Now go get yourself another drink, and try not to break anything else tonight." He winked. "I'm running out of things to smash." The room erupted in laughter. The tension shattered like the alabaster birds. People started talking again, moving, breathing. But Jane stood there for a moment longer, Frank's arms still around her shoulders, and she understood what had just happened. Frank Sinatra had seen her mortification, her embarrassment, her fear, and in one spontaneous gesture, he'd taken all of that weight off her shoulders and put it on his own. He'd broken the second bird so she wouldn't be alone in her mistake. So the story wouldn't be Jane Hoag broke NY's favorite possession. It would be Frank Sinatra broke NY's birds. And nobody would blame Jane, because Frank had made it about his choice, not her accident. Later that night, after most guests had left, Jane found Nancy Sr. in the kitchen. "Mrs. Sinatra, I'm so sorry about the birds. I'll replace them. All broke." Nancy took Jane's hands. "Sweetheart, stop. Those birds were beautiful, but they were just objects. What Frank did tonight, that was beautiful too. More beautiful than any alabaster bird." "What do you mean?" Nancy smiled. "He saw you in pain, and he fixed it. That's who Frank is. That's who he's always been. He can't stand to see someone hurting, especially when it's not their fault." "But I broke it by accident. You didn't mean to, and Frank knew that. So he made sure everyone in that room knew it too. He made sure you wouldn't spend the rest of the night or the rest of your life feeling terrible about an accident." Jane wiped her eyes. "Those birds meant something to you, didn't they?" Nancy nodded. "Frank gave them to me years ago when we were still married. They were from Italy. He brought them back from a tour." Jane's face crumpled. "Oh my God, that makes it so much worse." "No," Nancy said firmly. "That makes what he did so much better. He knew what they meant. He knew I loved them. And he broke the second one anyway, because you mattered more. Your feelings mattered more. That's the man I married. That's the man I still care about." Even after everything, the story spread through Hollywood in the days that followed. Not through gossip columns, through personal conversations. People who'd been at the party told their friends. Their friends told others. "You should have seen it. This girl breaks this priceless bird." And Sinatra just walks over, breaks the other one like it's nothing. Like it's the most natural thing in the world. Why would he do that? Because he's Frank Sinatra. Because he's got more class in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. Jane told the story at Life magazine. Her editor was fascinated. "You should write it. A profile on Sinatra. Use that story as the opening." But Jane refused. "I can't. It feels too personal. Like I'd be exploiting his kindness." Her editor understood. "Fair enough. But that story tells you everything you need to know about who Frank Sinatra really is." Years passed. Jane Hoag built a successful career in journalism. She covered major stories, interviewed important people, won awards. But whenever anyone asked her about the most memorable moment of her career, she always told the same story: the alabaster birds. In 1985, 20 years after that party, Jane was assigned to interview Frank Sinatra for a Life magazine retrospective. She was nervous. She hadn't seen him since that night. They met at his office in Los Angeles. Frank, now 69 years old, still sharp, still charming, greeted her warmly. "Jane Hoag, I remember you, NY's friend. You remember me?" Frank smiled. "Of course, you're the one who made me break NY's favorite birds." Jane laughed, tears springing to her eyes. "You remember that? How could I forget? You were so upset. I thought you were going to faint." They sat down. Jane pulled out her recorder, but before she started the interview she said, "Mr. Sinatra, Frank, I need to ask you something. That night with the birds, why did you do that?" Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you were a kid. You made a mistake, and I saw your face. You looked like the world was ending. And I thought, this is stupid. It's just a thing. Why should you carry this? Why should you go home tonight and lie awake feeling terrible about something that doesn't matter?" But it did matter. It mattered to Nancy. It mattered less than you did. Frank said simply, "Nancy and I have been through a lot together. We've lost things, real things, important things. A couple of alabaster birds. That's nothing. But you were just starting out. You had your whole life ahead of you. I didn't want you to remember that night as the night you screwed up in front of Frank Sinatra. I wanted you to remember it as the night you learned that mistakes happen and the world doesn't end." Jane was crying now. "You have no idea what that meant to me. I've thought about that night so many times. Whenever I screw up, whenever I make a mistake, I think about you breaking that second bird. And I remember that it's okay, that I can fix things, that I don't have to be perfect." Frank reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Good, then it was worth it. Can I tell this story?" "In the article," Frank smiled. "Sure, kid, tell it. Maybe someone else will read it and learn the same lesson." The article ran in Life magazine in December 1985. The story of the alabaster birds was the opening. It became one of the most read profiles of Frank Sinatra's career. Letters poured in. People wrote to say they'd been moved by the story, that it had changed how they thought about mistakes, about grace, about what it means to have class. One letter came from a teacher who said she'd read the story to her class. "I want my students to understand that kindness isn't just about being nice. It's about seeing someone in pain and taking action to ease that pain, even if it costs you something." Another letter came from a mother who wrote, "My daughter broke a vase that belonged to my grandmother. I was so angry, but then I read your article and I realized the vase didn't matter. What mattered was teaching my daughter that mistakes are human. So I told her the story of Frank Sinatra and the alabaster birds, and we threw the pieces away together." Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. Jane Hoag attended his funeral. She was 57 years old now. She stood in the back of the church, listening to the tributes. People talked about Frank's music, his films, his impact on American culture. All true, all important. But Jane kept thinking about two alabaster birds shattered on a marble floor, and a man who'd understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is make someone feel less alone in their mistake. After the service, Jane approached Nancy Sinatra Jr., now in her late 50s. "Nancy, I don't know if you remember me." Nancy smiled. "Of course I do, Jane. The birds." They both laughed through their tears. "Your father saved me that night," Jane said. "Not just from embarrassment, from something bigger. He taught me what grace looks like." Nancy took Jane's hands. "He taught us all that. That's his real legacy. Not the songs, not the movies, the way he made people feel, the way he saw pain and couldn't walk past it. Today, when people talk about Frank Sinatra, they talk about My Way and New York. They talk about the Rat Pack and Ava Gardner and the mob rumors. But those who knew him tell different stories. They tell the story of the alabaster birds. They tell it to their children, to their students, to anyone who will listen, because it's a story about more than Frank Sinatra. It's a story about what it means to be human, to make mistakes, and to have someone see you in your worst moment and decide that you're worth more than whatever you broke. The alabaster birds are long gone, swept away that night, thrown away with the trash. But what they represent, what Frank's gesture represented, that's still here in every person who reads this story and thinks, maybe I can be that kind of person. Maybe I can see someone in pain and ease it. Maybe I can break my own alabaster bird so someone else doesn't feel alone. Frank Sinatra spent his life making music that moved millions. But on one Saturday night in 1965, in front of 40 witnesses, he did something that moved them even more. He saw a young woman breaking, and he broke something himself so she wouldn't have to break alone. That's not fame, that's not talent, that's grace. Pure, spontaneous, unforgettable grace. And it's the most beautiful thing Frank Sinatra ever did.